Alright, so we're about to come up on Corrine, Utah. Corrine is an important place for us to discuss when we talk about the impacts of the railroad, because when the transcontinental line was being built, there were a few people who set up the town of Corrine to be the beneficiary of everything the rail line would bring. Specifically all of the economic boom that it would bring. Corrine it established itself in an effort to become a massive economic powerhouse in Utah by positioning itself right next to the rail line. So in a moment here, we're going to be entering Corrine. I'm going to show you basically all of Corrine in the matter of a few hundred feet here. So we're coming up on the outskirts of Corrine right now. You'll see that there's schools and houses to your right. Homes are really all you tend to find here. We're on Corrine Center Street right now. We've basically just entered the city. And you'll notice we have Mimi's Bar and Grill, it looks like. Golden Spike diner joint there. Corrine City welcoming sign. And as soon as we've entered, we've now left Corrine. So you'll notice Corrine didn't become this boom of a city that the founders of it intended for it to be. Part of the reason for that is because they hedged their bets on becoming the rail line transfer city. They wanted to become the city where north and south rails would transfer to east and west rails, so that they would be the connecting point for the mining cities that were scattered all over. Obviously, as you can tell, it didn't happen. In fact, it really didn't happen. They saw some initial growth and an initial boom. I think at their peak, they were at a population of about 1,000, which was pretty good at the time. But it didn't last very long. Part of the reason was because of their demographic. So their effort, they called themselves really the Gentile capital of Utah. And the reason they called themselves that was because they prided themselves in the fact that they populated the whole city with people who were not Mormons. And that was their aim. They wanted to have a strong economic city in Utah that was not LDS controlled. So the founders of the city were non-Mormons and retired Union Army officials who came specifically for that purpose, to set up and prop up a potentially economic powerhouse city that could compete with cities like Salt Lake City that were really an arm extending from the Mormon Church. So unfortunately for them, what ended up happening was a line route, what do they call it? Diversion or rerouting happened in Ogden as opposed to Corrine. And that was under direct instruction from Brigham Young. And part of the purpose there, again, was that Young was deciding, I want Ogden to be the transfer city. And so when he made that decision and he bought the land for it, then suddenly the project happened and Corrine was subverted. They were no longer viable for becoming that transfer city and lost their opportunity to become the boom city they were aiming for. So we're going to look at Ogden in a minute just to see the stark contrast between the two cities and just how much that connection to the railroad made all the difference. All right, so we have arrived at Ogden, Utah. This is behind me. This is Union Station. I know the sun is backlighting everything right now, so it's real hard to see, but let me get a little closer, see if we can see it in the shade here. The architecture of this building is quite magnificent. Part of the sad part is that this building burned down, had to be rebuilt, so it's not quite the way it was, but it is still a beautifully constructed building. Union Station was the great symbol of Ogden becoming that central railroading hub in Utah. So part of the significance here is the fact that Ogden came to be known as the Junction City of the West. And people would say by the end of it all that you can't go anywhere without going to Ogden, and part of the reason for that was because whether you were in Missouri trying to get to Portland, or in St. Louis trying to get to Seattle or San Francisco or wherever, if you were trying to get from east to west for any reason, you were basically always going through Ogden. And Union Station was at the heart of that. They came through here every time. So what ended up happening ultimately is the street that branched straight out of Union Station, 25th Street, became the most popular place to go for travelers who stopped here at Union Station. So I'm going to show you a glimpse of it here as I walk across the street. This is 25th Street, and as you can see, there are businesses galore. This is very different from what we saw in Corrine. In Corrine, there's like 2 businesses total, and that's even today, but here in Ogden, we just have business on 25th Street, and it was that way clear back in the heyday of the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, clear through to the 1910s, 1920s. This place was hopping. And I'll tell you a little bit about this. It's kind of an interesting parallel to Corrine in some ways, because many of the people who founded Corrine ended up moving to Ogden when it became the transfer city, set up shop here. So they brought with them some of their efforts, specifically their what we could call their Gentile efforts, right? Because in Corrine, that was something that set Corrine apart, is they tried to be as non-Mormon as possible, and that included opening as many saloons, having as many forms of entertainment that they could possibly stuff into the city that were not necessarily compatible with Mormon culture, and they loved that, and that's part of what ended up being brought here to Ogden as well. So much so that Ogden came to have a very interesting reputation. Not only was, and I'll give you another view here of the streets. You can see some of these places are called 2-Bit Street Cafe, so forth. This place used to be, 25th Street used to be called 2-Bit Street because it was said that you could purchase pretty much anything for 2 bits on Ogden's 25th Street. 2 bits was like a quarter. And that was meant in a relatively derogatory way. You could purchase anything you could possibly want for 2 bits in Ogden's 25th Street. More than, I guess, the brothels and the alcohol was offered here, there was some very interesting business, to the extent that you see lots of hotel buildings here. Lots of housing was offered. The probably the most famous hotel on 25th Street was one that came to be called, and I have it written down here, it was called Dawson's Murder Company by the people who knew it. And it was called that because it secretly ran a murder for hire business within the hotel. They would lure specific individuals that were either targeted for hire or just wealthy people found at Union Station. They would lure them in with pretty girls or something, promise of alcohol or whatever, and eventually they get them into the building, poison them, steal all that they have, and toss them out back. So that was the kind of very interesting type of thing that would happen here in Ogden's heyday. You can see Union Station in the background there. It's really at the forefront of everything that happens in this place. Part of the reason it got to be so interesting was because it saw such a constant influx of new people from different places all over. And oftentimes they were transient. They weren't here to stay, so they weren't afraid to do some pretty crazy things. When Ogden was first facing this transition from its agricultural roots to a bustling business due to Union Station, the city leaders made quite an effort to change the city, even to the extent that they changed the street names. Many of the street names up to that point were named after names and people of interest in the Mormon culture, and they changed them to represent names of US presidents and things like that. And that just sort of highlights, I guess, the level of transition that was in effect once the railroad transfer hub really became established here after the Transcontinental Railroad got finished in 1869. An interesting bit about that Union Station is that when it was first built, the man who built it was inspired by European cathedrals. So he tried to make it look as cathedral-esque as possible. It came to be widely known as the Cathedral of the West. Beautiful building. Had a clock tower and everything. It's real sad that it burned down. They tried to restore it as best they could, but on a much lighter penny than before. Some interesting people in the bustle of Ogden. We had a certain woman named Belle London, and Belle London was she was infamously known as the manager of all of Ogden's darker sides. She was intimately involved in what we could consider the red light district of Ogden. So she managed and ran a lot of the brothels and prostitution rings going on in the city.
helped with some smuggling and things like that. Her reputation served her pretty well in the long run. Turned out that later on, Salt Lake City was facing a prostitution issue that they were very embarrassed about. And to fix that, quote unquote, fix that issue, the city council in Salt Lake City decided that they would, I guess, forcibly move the rings of prostitution going on in the city onto one specific street that was walled off. And then they called Belle London, who had this reputation, and asked her to leave Ogden, come to Salt Lake City and manage it all for them, to keep it out of their hair. So interesting business deal, right? And you can't imagine a city council making a deal like that today, but nevertheless it happened, and her skills were put to use, I suppose. But another interesting figure that you may have heard of before, we're coming just close to the end of 25th Street here. You can tell this is a much bigger city than Corrine, right? It's massive. But another interesting figure, you may know the name. His name was Al Capone. He was the mob boss of Chicago. He certainly had a reputation. Ruthless reputation. He was, Chicago was known as one of the more dangerous places to be. And he was behind a lot of that, but in his visit to Ogden, and we do have stories of him coming to visit here. Again, it was a major hub. Lots of people came. But in a story about his visit here, we have anecdotes about how he labeled Ogden as too wild a city for even him. So I guess that gives you a bit of a flavor for just how crazy this place was. And this is going to bleed a little bit into some of the topics relevant to future units, specifically the Roaring Twenties, because this city continued to be a central hub for several decades. And during the 1920s, we were facing an effort of prohibition. And the people of Ogden were very much not fond of prohibition, at least the business owners that sold liquor, and many of them did. So bootlegging and setting up speakeasies was a prominent business venture in Ogden. We have loads of stories of secret taps where they had like a magic switch under the table that they would flip if somebody was coming in for an inspection, and they flip the switch and it turns the whiskey into soda water, so that nobody was the wiser, right? Even though everybody in there was drunk. We had several instances of police officers being bought off by these businesses that were selling liquor under the table. And ultimately, we have even so wildest stories about secret networks of underground tunnels that connected several of the businesses here to assist in the bootlegging effort, bring alcohol into the streets. We even have one story about an effort at remodeling that went wrong. So wrong that a horse and buggy ended up falling through the street into what they deemed part of this secret underground tunneling And it was actually a it was just a drug den. It had a whole bunch of opiates and things inside. But yeah, so that's more, I guess, stories to suggest just how wild a time you could have had in Ogden in that period of 1870s through the 1930s, 40s, really. And Ogden today, I mean, it continues to be a very happening place. 25th Street, it kind of died out with the advent of air travel, because trains became obsolete and suddenly Union Station was used very little. But that worked to the benefit of preserving a lot of what's still visible here on 25th Street. It made it so that a lot of it was not bulldozed and rebuilt into other things because it became so obsolete. People developed in other parts of Ogden, and so Ogden spread wide instead of building up, which is quite nice from a historical perspective. We still have lots to look at here, some old buildings and things, but it's definitely worth coming to check out 25th Street here. I would certainly recommend a visit to Union Station. They have a really nice museum in there. I'm actually here on the 4th of July, so it's not open, but they are still in business even with all of the COVID stuff going on. I think they have limited hours, but yeah, it's a nice place to come for some food, chill and relax, buy a few gifts at a gift shop, I guess, and learn a bit about an Ogden in a time gone by. But that's going to conclude our adventures in coming to understand a little bit more about the effects of the Transcontinental Railroad here in Utah. And we'll see you next time. Here's one last look at Union Station here. I made it right back just in time. We'll see ya.